Issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
Hello, Kentuckiana. You're listening to Kentucky's Voice on 970 AM. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus, as well as the Louisville Tea Party. Today we have a very interesting show. Our guest is going to be a state rep by the name of TJ Roberts. If you listen to our show consistently, you've probably heard him on once or twice before. But we're going to talk into a whole range of issues on that topic. But let me first take care of a little business. If you're interested in hearing this show past right now on 970 AM, you can view the live stream of our podcast, which is on Facebook Live. You can find that at the Kentucky's Voice Facebook channel. There's also a live stream on the YouTube channel, which you can also find by searching for Kentucky's Voice on YouTube. I think it's actually the KY Voice if you're going directly to it, but you can do that search. We also are on TV, local TV. If you have Spectrum on Channel 21, which is WBNA, we have a rebroadcast of this at 12:30, 4, and 8 p.m. So all of those are options if you want to view our show. If you want to text in, I will make an effort to include your comments if they're appropriate for the show, of course. If you want to text in, you can do that at 502-571-0970. Now, we are a listener-supported ministry /radio program /podcast. If you're interested in supporting these efforts to basically bring conservative talk radio and discussion of local and state politics to the Louisville area, which we desperately need, you can text that same number I just gave you. That's 502-571-0970. Just text the word give, and there, someone behind the scenes will send out a link that you can go to a website in order to give. You can also go to that website directly at kyvoice.org. So when you go to your browser, instead of a .com at the end, you do kyvoice.org. Okay, I think that's most of the business ahead of time. I did want to bring up one topic. I know a lot of people are sports fans here in this area. Congratulations, by the way, to the Louisville Cardinals on embarrassing my Kentucky Wildcats on the football field. It was so embarrassing, in fact, that apparently the University of Kentucky has fired their head football coach after 13 seasons, Mark Stoops. So we may actually have a little bit of discussion later on in the show about the amount of money that's being spent on that. But producer, could you put up the statement by the University of Kentucky's president? Yep, there we go. So, and I think it's partially covered up by that chyron on the bottom. But basically, the president of the University of Kentucky, after the decision was made to move on to another head coach, he mentions that it is critical and important that we are competitive and successful in football. That is our goal. That is our focus, and we intend to be successful. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about how the public does fund the University of Kentucky, the University of Louisville, and all of our other public institutions. His contract is going to pay him $38 million in order to not coach football. So we might get into a little bit of discussion about what contracts are appropriate for public employees. And yes, the football coach at your local public university is a public employee. The University of Kentucky's athletic department does self-support, so they bring in as much money as they spend, and sometimes they have a little bit of a surplus. But nevertheless, these are important issues, and it's just an example I want to say to our viewers of how much your everyday life, that sports game that maybe you're watching on the weekends, is actually impacted by politics. The state government does give considerable amount of money to the University of Kentucky, Louisville, Western Kentucky, Northern Kentucky, Moorhead, and Murray State. So we'll have some more discussion with TJ Roberts right after the break. Join us later.
kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. You're listening to us on 970 AM, and we thank you at Kentucky's Voice. If you want to go to the website for Kentucky's Voice and either give or find out all of the different options on how you can view this later, go to kyvoice.org. That's O-R-G at the end, org. Okay. Now, I'm blessed to be joined by a very honored guest, and that's a state representative for District 66, which I believe is all in Boone County, northern Kentucky area. That state rep is named TJ Roberts. If we could bring him on. Hi, TJ. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, Lance.
Just first off, is your district entirely within Boone?
That is correct. I just covered the northern half of Boone County and much of the western half as well. So.
Okay. If you're habitually on X, you probably have seen TJ. He does a great job of talking about all the interesting things that he's doing online. You can go to that at real TJ Roberts. So you can find that on X. He kind of reposts things from X over on Facebook as well. But TJ actually is very good at networking and marketing, and so that's actually a blessing as a politician. I recommend that you go to that X site. So TJ, just tell us a little bit first about what brought you into politics. You're a freshman legislator. You were just elected a little over a year ago. You've had your first session and you're going into your second one, but you are up for re-election next May in the primary, if you have a primary opponent, and then in November in the general election. So what brought you into politics?
So I actually got involved at a rather young age. One of the things I don't necessarily talk about too much on the public side of things. So my father passed away from a drug overdose when I was 6 years old, and that just demonstrated that to me that there was something fundamentally broken in our society. And
Right.
throughout my life, that got me more heavily involved. And as I looked into what happened and what we can do to try to fix that, I realized in many instances, government is not the solution to the problem. It often is the problem. So even in my early years, I was involved with the Northern Kentucky Tea Party, reading Ron Paul when I was in middle school and
Right.
things along those lines. So got involved there in 2016. After Rand Paul had dropped out of the presidential race, I got involved, one, with Senator Paul's reelection for US Senate, but also knocking doors for President Trump. And got involved with movements like Young Americans for Liberty. In 2017, got involved with Turning Point, and the rest was history. And from there, I really started to see the importance of not just the federal level, but also the state level. And I think that's the large part of just
Yeah.
those people who've brought me up in this movement,
Right.
Thomas Massey, especially, just showing that the 10th Amendment matters.
That's
And
right. We'll get into that later. We'll talk about
yes,
some of the bills that you filed to protect the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment basically is a separate federalist separation of powers between state and federal government. We see a lot of diplomas. If you're watching online on the podcast, we see some diplomas in the background. TJ does look young, but he is a licensed lawyer in the state of Kentucky. Is that right? And then could you just tell us a little bit about your law practice, who you work with, that kind of stuff?
sure. Yeah. So I'm an associate attorney at Chris Wiest, attorney at law. Chris and I handle the constitutional law cases that need to be handled the most. In fact, I was a client of Chris's at one point in 2020. I almost went to jail for going to church on Resurrection Sunday, and because of Chris, I did not. I was able to file a federal lawsuit against the governor, against the prosecutor, in order to enjoin them from enforcing the blatantly unconstitutional church ban against me. And we were able to win in a unanimous decision in the Sixth Circuit, which set the precedent that the Supreme Court later used to strike down these COVID orders in New York and California. So it was a huge blessing, and that really shifted my direction, because initially I was going to go into law school for like corporate law, make $250,000 a year straight out of law school. And I made the dumbest financial move of my life, but also the most fulfilling decision of my life by going into constitutional litigation instead. So our main areas, we do First Amendment law, Fourth Amendment law. My area of specialty is actually Second Amendment law,
Right.
and I've handled cases along those lines that have been just there is something uniquely fulfilling about being able to vindicate the rights of Americans. And I'm currently licensed in Kentucky, Ohio, and in the federal courts, the Southern District of Ohio, the Sixth Circuit, the Eastern District of Kentucky, and the Western District of Kentucky.
Okay. So and I encounter this all the time when I go talking to groups or talking to other activists, and there's a hesitation for people to embrace lawyers and on our side of the Republican Party, and especially on our side of politics. Like, lawyer is a bad word among conservative activists, and so I want to dispel that. If you ever have problems in the legal system, you want a good lawyer on your side. And so TJ is an example of a person who understands that the primary role of our government is to protect our rights. It's actually not even the primary goal isn't even to ensure our safety, because the police are going to show up minutes or hours after any crime is committed. That's typically how things work. You are primarily responsible for your own safety. What the government is there to do is to protect your rights, and especially to protect your rights from the government. The entity that I am most worried about my rights being violated by is actually the government itself. Okay, so I do want to emphasize I do support TJ. TJ is kind of right in the heart. He's one of the thought leaders on the liberty wing of the Republican Party. He's pushing for constitutional conservatism, fiscal conservatism, and social conservative, as well as trying to root out corruption in our government, which I think, to a layperson, that's my description of what the liberty wing of the Republican Party is. So, TJ, this was your first session in the General Assembly. Just tell me a little bit about your impressions. And you, which is somewhat unusual, you actually got a bill or two through most of the process, and one of them actually got filed into law as priority legislation, HB2, in your first session. So talk a little bit, just start with HB2, and then we'll get into some other legislation that you actually have already got passed.
Sure. So in 2024, we included an exemption on sales and use taxes on bullion, so gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, which, by the way, the Constitution is clear: gold and silver is legitimate money.
Mhm.
And the legislature was able to get it to where we're not taxing money anymore. It's amazing we ever were in the first place. But the governor purported to do a line item veto
Yeah.
of that specific provision.
Which line item vetoes are generally legal, but there are only specific circumstances in which they are legal in the state. Go ahead.
So in the Kentucky, it's actually the other way around. They're generally illegal. He can only do a line item veto on appropriations
Right.
bills, which is
Right.
spending bills. Um, this is a revenue bill. That's not spending. So after an attorney general opinion stating this is illegal, this line item veto may as well not have happened, we enrolled the law. The Secretary of State enrolled it and codified it. Then in August of 2024, the governor signs an executive order directing the Department of Revenue to continue collecting these taxes that we had repealed.
Right.
It was an abomination not only to the calls for sound money, it was also an abomination to the basic concept of separation of powers, where this governor thinks of himself as a king, where he's the lawmaker and the law enforcer, which is something that our forefathers fought a revolution to prevent.
That's right.
And so I introduced a piece of legislation that does the following. One, it reaffirms the exemption on gold and silver and platinum and palladium from sales and use taxation. Second, it also entitles people who were illegally taxed to a refund with interest, and also their attorney fees through a judicial cause of action against the Department of Revenue. And third, this is where the teeth really came in.
Mhm.
It made it clear that if the governor decided to continue collecting these taxes after the codification of House Bill 2, that he would be liable for individual capacity damages for $1,000 per day per taxpayer under a class action lawsuit.
Right.
So this was a huge victory. And by the way, I'm the first year legislator in Kentucky history to get House Bill 2 status on this, because this was not just a gold and silver bill, which is
Right.
extremely important to me. It's also a separation of powers bill.
That's
It
right.
made clear that the power of the purse belongs with the legislature. And it finally solved this problem because we have a governor who does not obey the law. And it showed a pathway for how we can remedy this situation.
Right. Yeah. So just to reiterate and maybe simplify that a little bit, the governor refused to enforce the law that the legislature, who is the entity that makes laws in this state, had required him to do. He refused to stop people from charging sales and use tax on the sale of gold, silver, etc. So
That's correct.
TJ passed a bill that basically requires it, or you're going to be able to be sued by the average citizen. Join us after the break.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice on 970 AM. I want to remind our viewers you can find this podcast on both Facebook and YouTube. If you search for Kentucky's Voice on that channel, you'll be able to find clips of the show. You can also see us on local TV if you have Spectrum, and that's channel 21 at 12:30, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. Okay, we're joined by an honored guest, State Legislature TJ Roberts from District 66, which is in northern Kentucky, Boone County. If you were listening before the break, you heard us talking about one of the bills that he got passed, H.R. 2. That bill basically held the governor's feet to the fire and required him to follow the law in terms of not charging sales and use tax on silver, gold, other types of coinage. TJ, talk a little bit about another piece of legislation that got quite a bit of movement. Ultimately, it got stuck in another bill, but it was basically a state version of Doge. So tell us a little bit about that. What was the goal of that legislation, and what actually got through?
Absolutely. So Kentucky Doge was my House Joint Resolution 50, and we got that heard and passed out of the state government committee. What this would have done is it would have created a task force for the interim for legislators to work with policy experts in order to identify waste, fraud, and abuse and get us back to zero-based budgeting. Lance, one of the most shocking numbers I've ever heard
Yeah.
is how little spending we actually vote on as legislators. We have the power of the purse, but in fiscal year 2025, only 7% of our spending was actually voted through line item.
Yeah.
For fiscal year 2026, it's 16%. So we're moving in the right direction, but that should be every penny that we spend. It's not our money, it's the people's money that we're voting to spend, and we should be much more considerate of that fact. And so we're on a pathway to abolish the income tax. And after we abolish the income tax, I want to take a sledgehammer to property taxation as well. We can't do that, though, if we're spending recklessly and wastefully. And
Right.
so we have a balanced budget requirement, which is a blessing in that we can't take on debt, but it's also a curse in that we can't cut taxes as fast as I would like to. Kentucky Doge was a way to address that. So what House Joint Resolution 50 ultimately became, sorry, House Concurrent Resolution 50, was it became Floor Amendment 3 to Senate Bill 2020 to Senate Bill 25. What this bill did was it requires the executive branch now to give a twice a year report to the legislature outlining the areas where we can cut costs and provide the same services, the areas where we can use automation or
Right.
other more efficient means to provide these services in order to cut costs. And finally, what are some services that have just outlived their usefulness that we should consider abolishing altogether?
Right.
So that way we can actually get our surpluses higher. So that way we can hit those revenue marks quicker for abolishing the income tax
Right.
and hopefully get to a point where we can even start chipping away at property taxation as well.
Okay. So
Unfortunately, they're not following the law though.
right. So just to basically simplify that again, 93% of our budget isn't really voted on or really examined by the state legislature every year. It's like we just continue on what we spent last year. And so
Right.
if we don't look at that 93%, we're basically the bulk of all the spending of the state government never really gets scrutiny by the state legislature. And so your bill would have required, or it did, your bill does require the cabinet officials and the executive branch under the governor to report out on ways to cut spending. And so one example where this really came to a head was there was a meeting of the Appropriations Committee in the interim, which is chaired by a guy named Jason Petrie. And in that discussion, they had the Office of the State Budget Director, so the person that's in charge of monitoring finances for the governor. That person was reporting out to the interim committee, and they just basically wanted a report of his initial proposals for what the spending should be at the various levels of the state government. And the state budget director basically refused until the governor said, it's okay, and this is my final version that I want you to go out and defend. They wanted to see the work that goes into the state budget by the governor, or the state budget proposal by the governor. And he refused to give it without the governor basically just giving it a once over and deciding what he actually wanted to advocate for or not. Okay, so again, we need to be slashing government spending at both the federal level, especially, but even at the state level. So another topic that's close to your heart, I can tell because you're filing 2 bills on these topics, is prison reform, basically, or criminal justice reform, but also prison reform. And so can you tell me a little bit, we've talked about this on a previous show, but you're actually filing the legislation. So I want you to tell us a little bit of the background of the Ronald Exantis case and what happened and what you're trying to change about the laws as regards to that.
Certainly. So almost exactly 10 years ago to this day, this monster um, broke into a home in the dead of night, stole a knife from the kitchen, went upstairs, and brutally murdered a 6-year-old boy named Logan Tipton. Proceeded to stab his 7 and 11-year-old sisters, and then beat the living crap out of his father as well. And fortunately, the father was able to subdue him and hold him down until the police arrived. That's where the good news of this case ends. He was charged with burglary, he was charged with murder, and he was charged with 3 counts of second-degree assault. By the way, those assault charges were not considered violent crime under Kentucky law at the time. And he pled insanity,
Yeah.
basically maintaining that the drugs he was using rendered him insane. And Kentucky has the loosest insanity defense in the entire country, by the way. But even then, this should have been a slam dunk case of guilty on all counts. The jury rendered a split verdict where they found him not guilty by reason of insanity for murder and burglary, but they found him guilty for the 3 assaults. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Yeah.
But he was released in 7 years because of a program that Kentucky has called mandatory reentry supervision, which you have to be sentenced to more than 2 years in prison in order to be eligible for. And it is for those who are ineligible for parole. It's for the people who have been denied parole by the parole board over and over again. And these parole boards, by the way, they're pretty loose on crime. They're soft on crime.
Right.
It was just a matter of trying to save about $11 million a year, which when you look at the overall budget area, that's a rounding error.
Right.
It's nothing. Um, I'm about as for abolishing wasteful spending as much as humanly possible. But let's be very clear. The role of government is protecting life, liberty, and property.
Right.
You need a good justice system in order to protect any of those. And we failed that family.
Yep.
We failed the Tipton family. So we're working on legislation. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be taking these bills, we're combining them. And ultimately, Dan Pfister is going to be filing it. I'm going to be primary co-sponsoring it.
Okay.
It happened in Representative Pfister's
That's
district,
right. In
and he has
Versailles.
been a
Yep.
good, yes, and he has been a good advocate for this. So it's going to do three things at least. There might be other matters in this depending on what we can address to make sure that something like this never happens again. But at a minimum, Logan's Law will, one, abolish mandatory reentry supervision to make sure that if someone's been denied parole, they're serving their sentence. Second, it's going to abolish split verdicts on the insanity defense. Look, everything that this animal did was within the space of a couple minutes. There's no way he was insane for
Right.
charge 1 and 2, but sane for charges 3, 4, and 5.
Right. It doesn't even
He
make
was
sense.
sane.
Right.
He knew what they were doing. It's nothing short of jury misconduct. And finally, we're going to tighten the screws on the insanity defense. And we're going to look into that to make sure that someone can't say, oh, I was blackout drunk, or oh, I was high, and that means I shouldn't be held criminally liable.
Right.
At a minimum, we're going to be doing those things because Kentucky needs to be a safe place to raise a family.
Okay. All right. Thank you to TJ Roberts for that discussion of some of the legal issues he's trying to address next session. When we come back, we're going to talk about some other issues like red flag laws and constitutional right to bear arms. Join us after the break.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson of the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. Today we are joined by a state legislature by the name of TJ Roberts. He represents District 66, which is he's one of several legislators that represent Boone County, which is I think it's fair to say, a bastion of liberty republicanism in northern Kentucky. In previous segments, he's talked about some of the legislation he's already got passed, even as a first-term legislator. And we're going to continue on discussion of some other legislation that he is looking to pass or at least to stop. And so I always say this for people, more important than the legislation that you get passed, it's the legislation that you can help stop from getting passed. And so one of those topics that we're going to get into in this segment is red flag gun laws. Basically, the ability of the state without adequate due process to take away a person's Second Amendment right to bear arms merely based on an accusation or a claim by someone. This person is dangerous and they therefore shouldn't have a gun, or even this person is crazy and they shouldn't be allowed to have a gun. A red flag gun law, and sometimes these are called. And let me actually find the rights retention. What is, TJ? What's the name that they always use as a euphemism for a red flag gun law? It's rights retention.
I don't remember what the CA stands for, but they try to say it's a rights retention idea, which is one of the most laughable terms. I mean, it's almost like calling the Patriot Act patriotic or the Affordable Care Act affordable.
That's right. That's right. So tell us a little bit about what these red flag gun laws are and what you want to do to basically, if not completely ban them forever, basically set up some extremely high requirements for due process when we're talking about taking away someone's constitutional rights.
Sure. So a red flag law, at least as we look at it through most states, is an ex parte order, meaning you don't have a right to appear in court. You don't have a right to confront your accuser. You don't have a right to present arguments. You don't have a right to present contradictory evidence. None of that. A person makes a complaint about you, alleging you have done something or are about to do something that makes you dangerous to yourself or to others. The judge signs off on an order without hearing the other side, without seeing evidence, and that results in individuals being disarmed. And by the way, these laws have gotten people killed.
Mhm.
There have been times where there have been attempts to execute red flag orders as early as 4 in the morning in Maryland, and it resulted in a person not knowing what's going on, and they thought someone was breaking into their house, and the police were in the unfortunate situation where they had to protect themselves, and it resulted in this innocent person being killed.
Right.
And that's just one instance that I can think of. There are plenty of other instances where red flag laws have gotten people killed. Um, Kentucky doesn't have a specifically codified red flag law, but our judiciary has broadly interpreted our emergency protective orders and interpersonal protective orders to basically be a red flag law. So if you have an EPO or IPO issued against you, at the bottom of the document, it specifically says that this order qualifies you for disarmament under 18 U.S. Code 922 G8.
Right.
It does not. This is the order that says that if you have a domestic violence order against you, you cannot have a firearm. That's federal law.
Right.
But if you read that statute, it requires you the ability to present evidence, cross-examine witnesses. It even explicitly says ex parte orders are not domestic violence orders under that statute.
Right.
So we have a misconstruction of the law. So, by the way, in Kentucky, about 19,000 EPOs and IPOs are granted per year. And out of those 19,000, only about 6,000 of them ever are made into true domestic violence orders once evidence is presented and the other side of the story can be told. In other words, more than 2/3 of these orders are false. More than 2/3 of these orders are resulting in the deprivation of the basic civil right to protect yourself
Right.
of over 13,000 people every year in Kentucky. So I'm introducing legislation. I had House Bill 83 last year that was more placeholder language of a red flag law shall not exist in Kentucky. This time I'm going to be very specific on it. The language is drafted. I'm filing it on day one that simply says ex parte orders shall not be a basis for gun confiscation in Kentucky.
Okay.
And that is just a simple area of it.
Yep.
If we're going to take away a constitutional right, for one, there's a much easier way to address domestic violence than a basic piece of paper that says stay away from this person. If someone's beating their spouse, you should arrest them and you should prosecute them and you should throw them in prison for a long time if they're
Okay.
actually doing it.
That's right.
You shouldn't just have a piece of paper saying stay away because no one's going to follow that order.
Okay. And to our listeners, that don't view this as just pure hysterics. Like, oh, we know that people are very protective of their constitutional rights, so we're just using this as a way to inflame people. This is a real proposal that has been made by both Democrats and Republicans, usually in bipartisan legislation in the state of Kentucky over the last several sessions. So Paul Hornback, who was a Republican from Shelby County, and then Whitney Westerfield, who actually ran for Attorney General of the state of Kentucky and was a state senator for several sessions, have signed on and basically been sponsors of legislation. This legislation usually gets the euphemism CAR law, CARR, and it's crisis aversion and rights retention. So it's just a weird Orwellian misuse of language. They basically try to just twist around what they're trying to do. And so instead of calling them red flag laws, they call them crisis aversion and rights retention. So be aware of that. There's another topic that I think you filed legislation, and if not, you can just tell us whether or not you support it. But it's working with certain types of felons to restore their Second Amendment rights after they have paid their debt to society. So do you want to talk a little bit about that issue? Have you filed legislation, or are you going to, or am I mixing you up with someone else?
So I haven't filed anything on that,
Okay.
mostly because that's a federal law right now.
Okay.
Under federal statute, all felons are barred
Right.
from ever owning or possessing a firearm. However, there have been legal challenges to that, and I do think they're valid.
Right.
Look, when you look at what a felony was at the time of the founding, it was murder, rape, kidnapping,
Right.
arson, burglary, robbery, treason, counterfeiting, and piracy.
Okay.
That was really it. We have made felonies out of everything else. By the way, the
Yeah, yeah.
penalty for all 9 of those offenses at the time of the founding was generally death.
Okay.
Obviously, you don't have a right to bear arms if you're dead.
That's right.
So, right, a felony at the time was a crime so egregious that the government would kill you over it. Now, a felony is anything that the government can put you in jail for a year or more.
Okay. So
That's
yep.
a huge difference.
I was mixing up some Supreme Court cases there. Nevertheless, it's something to have on our radar. And I don't think anyone is really suggesting that we want to allow felons, violent felons, to retain their rights to carry weapons, basically to bear arms. They've given up that right through their violent felonies, but there are a lot of things that are not violent felonies that are felonies. And so not only in many states, including in Kentucky, do they by default lose their right to vote, they also lose their right to bear arms. Another piece of legislation that you've been involved with, I think you're the primary co-sponsor, and were involved in maybe even drafting this legislation before you were in the legislature, is reducing the ability of public money to go towards lobbying. So this is a crazy situation where you as a taxpayer are actually funding people to go to the legislature and advocate against your interests or the things that you want to have said. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, ban taxpayer funded lobbying, I think, is the most important bill for any grassroots conservative, no matter what your most important issue is. Because if you have an issue that you genuinely care about to expand liberty, there is a taxpayer funded lobbyist working against you. Doesn't matter if it's free speech, doesn't matter if it's freedom of religion, doesn't matter if it's Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, any of these basic liberty issues, you will find your tax dollars being used to lobby against it. And by the way, even if you support it, I believe it's an unconscionable idea that you should be compelled to finance advocacy one way or the other. And that's something I've been working on since 2020 was when it first came up. In 2021, Felicia Rayburn introduced a bill to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying. I primary co-sponsored it. It was House Bill 254 in 2025. We got a significant number of co-sponsors on this thing, and it's basically just a Hyde Amendment.
Yeah.
These organizations like KCO, KLC, KSBA, they can all still lobby. They just can't use their tax dollars for it.
Right.
So that's all it is. It's like a Hyde Amendment, right? The Hyde Amendment said you can't use tax dollars for abortion. Well, Planned Parenthood still receives tax dollars. They still do abortions. They just separate the funds. Which, by the way, Planned Parenthood shouldn't receive a dime of money. But
Yeah, we
in
won't
my
get into
view,
that, but I
taxpayer-funded
agree.
lobbying
Right.
is taxpayer-funded lobbying. It's just compelled speech.
Right.
It's unconstitutional, and it's just a deeply immoral practice that needs to be abolished.
Right. And so just to reiterate on that, there are some First Amendment concerns here. Ultimately, everybody should be able to go to the state legislature and lobby their representatives, and that includes people that might be on a school board or the judge executive of your county, et cetera. But where we cross the line is when we are using public funds in order to pay for that lobbying. And that can take many forms, one of which is just travel reimbursement. Why is my money going to pay for your gas for you to go up there and advocate when you're advocating for something that I may not agree with? And so the Supreme Court has also drawn this line. There is a difference between allowing people to speak and then requiring people to finance speech that they do not agree with. So after the break, we might talk very briefly about that, but we'll also talk about some other issues and some other legislation that TJ Roberts is thinking about filing in this next session. Join us after the break for our last segment.
Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us, speak up, stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus and the Louisville Tea Party. Today we are joined by a special guest, which is State Representative T.J. Roberts, who is a lawyer in Northern Kentucky. He represents part of Boone County. At the end of the last segment, TJ talked about some legislation that he's a primary co-sponsor with Felicia Rayburn on that regulates the use of tax dollars for lobbying. Basically, your tax dollars shouldn't go towards paying for advocacy of speech that you fundamentally disagree with, and that includes lobbying of the legislature. If these public officials want to, on their own dime, or go up and legislate or lobby their legislators, they're perfectly able to. Another topic that I think is somewhat related is some of the speech that has come out of some of our public school employees, as well as our public higher education employees. So one example of this is there is a law professor at the University of Louisville by the name of Mark Murphy, who, as I guess is a side job, I don't know how much he makes from the law school versus as a cartoonist for the Courier-Journal, but there is a person who is a law professor and also a cartoonist by the name of Mark Murphy. Producer, can you put up a couple of examples of some cartoons that he has put up? So this one that came out recently relates to Pete Hegseth. TJ, do you want to basically say what he's even trying to communicate with this cartoon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, so let's be clear. This is an attack on Pete Hegseth and on every soldier who has served this nation well. I mean, it's showing his suit with his medals that he earned in his service to this nation, and each medal he is describing as a war crime. So let's talk about what the medals are that Pete Hegseth has earned. He earned 2 Bronze Stars for combat deployments, one under President Bush, one under President Obama. And he's saying that Mark Murphy says that combat veterans are war criminals.
Yeah.
He earned an Army Commendation Medal. So if you have that medal, Mark Murphy thinks you're a war criminal. He has a Combat Infantry Badge, which means Mark Murphy thinks you're a war criminal if you served in combat infantry. Further, he earned an Expert Infantryman Badge. So if you have an Expert Infantryman Badge, Mark Murphy thinks you're a war criminal.
That's right.
Ultimately, you can just condense it down to this. If you're in the military and you took an oath to defend this nation and her constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, Mark Murphy thinks you're a war criminal. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
Like, this is one of the most tasteless ones I've ever seen. And there's text on what his post was where he described supporters of President Trump and supporters of Pete Hegseth as, and I quote, murderous fascists.
Yeah.
And saying that because of your beliefs, you should be prosecuted in Nuremberg-style prosecutions where the most frequent penalty was the death penalty.
Yeah, that's right.
So
now, producer,
it's astonishing.
Can you put up the second cartoon that we just put as an example? And so it basically is an image where there is a woman's hand holding a cross, and the name on the woman's arm is Savannah Maddox, who is a colleague of T.J. Roberts, also from Northern Kentucky. She's holding a cross, and then there are other people that have their hands up in what looks like Nazi salutes. So the clear implication is that somehow Savannah Maddox's Christianity or advocacy for Christian beliefs as a member of the legislature is analogous to Nazis. So obviously, Mark Murphy is being intentionally provocative in both of these cases. I would argue he's being completely inappropriate in both of these cases, and he is a public employee. So can you just talk a little bit about your thoughts? I know ultimately, I don't want the government dictating what a public employee is able to say when they are not acting in their official duties. as a professor or whatever, a janitor at the state government. I don't think you do either. But so what issues do you think are raised by this? And more importantly, like, what are some ideas that maybe we can have to like try to balance out some of the political composition of our higher institutions of higher education who are training our leaders for tomorrow? What are some of those things that we might do to try to address just the distribution of political thought among our faculty?
Yeah, certainly. And so some of the things that are like that we can do for one is just make it to where faculty aren't choosing their own colleagues. You look
Yeah.
at the numbers that show the political ideology at our universities, it's very much so skewed in one direction, and it most certainly is not in the direction of constitutional conservatism. And
And
by the way,
actually, hang on, TJ. I actually have a graphic to illustrate that. Producer, could you put up that last graphic that basically shows the political affiliation of people in various subject matters at our universities? And you can see at the top, at least in the sample, this is from 2018. Every professor that was surveyed during this time period in 2018 that was a professor in communications or anthropology, English, sociology, art, music, all of those have compositions that are over 97% Democrat. That is not a random sampling. Clearly, there are systems in place to encourage the hiring of people with liberal worldviews or Democratic Party affiliations, and to discourage it for Republicans. Even at the very bottom there, where we have chemistry, engineering, you still see about 62% of the university professors are Democrat affiliated partisans. Okay, go ahead, TJ. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Sure, yeah, and just to respond to that second cartoon, I think it's worth noting that the Nazis had a very deep hatred of Christianity as they saw it as a threat
That's right.
to their goal for omnipotent big government. Just to point that out at the initial part, I don't. I've known Savannah Maddox for years, and she
Yep.
doesn't have a hateful bone in her body.
I
So
agree. Me
that
too.
type of attack is just abhorrent. And that's the thing. Like, this guy's a professor. Your tax dollars are subsidizing this crap. And when you look to this ideological bend, this is the problem where academia just exists in a vacuum. And we need to be addressing this issue of ensuring that our institutions are actually ideologically neutral, that they're preparing you for a career, and they're not just preparing you to have awkward conversations with your uncle at Thanksgiving.
That's
I
right.
mean, you can get you can get that all the training you need on that on YouTube. Um, i- i- it's just such an asinine thing to think that someone would malign these individuals. And by the way, I've had people who sit in his class reach out to me ever since I blew the whistle on this, including a Purple Heart recipient
Yeah.
who said that this is how he behaves in the classroom,
Right.
that conservative students do fear that their grades are suffering
Right.
because of their ideology.
But
Um,
I think
and
you put your finger on it. Well, I don't think we want the government regulating what a professor says. And
Correct.
that's not what we're advocating for here. But when we have a system that is biased in such a way that we're winding up with 100% of one party affiliation among people in a particular profession, there are some systematic issues that are causing for that distortion of what would be a normal marketplace. And I think you put your finger on it. When faculty members are the people that are in charge of picking who their colleagues are going to be, their biases influence that, and it becomes a self-perpetuating, and I would argue it's a negative feedback loop. So you get a majority of liberal thinkers within and liberal, I mean politically liberal, not liberal has a lot of meanings and connotations, but you have a bunch of left-wing people in a particular department. And of course, when they're hiring and in charge of hiring their colleagues, they pick people that have that are like-minded, that have the same perspectives as them. And so even when it isn't an intentional, and I think in many cases it is intentional, even when it isn't intentional, just the fact that they are the ones choosing who their colleagues are going to be self-perpetuates. And so I think one option that we have is to, instead of having hiring being determined by their colleagues, they are hired by people that are accountable to the state government. And that specifically is the university presidents. So I think ultimately we need to put the responsibility for having balanced hiring positions and having intellectual diversity among faculty as one of the priorities for all of our public universities. You're preparing people to go into a society that has a variety of political opinions, and if they aren't being exposed to those different opinions throughout their education, they're not able to function in society at the level that we need them to. Okay, so I think, ultimately, I don't know. I've actually proposed something similar to Jennifer Decker when we were talking about modifying some of the higher education, but I think that's an idea. Do you have any other legislation that you have an idea for this next session that you want to highlight?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most important issues that we can address right now is eminent domain reform. There is such a low burden in Kentucky on what it takes for the government to steal your property. So, some of the things that I want to do, I want to completely ban the use of eminent domain for transferring your property to another private entity. That's currently legal in Kentucky. I want to flip the presumption. Right now, it's presumed that the eminent domain project is okay. I want to make it to where the government has to prove their case that this is truly necessary if we're going to be taking people's property, where now you have to buy the attorney, you have to make the case that it's not necessary, which is such a ridiculous burden on it. Further, I want to change the compensating rate. I can just think about right now, if I had a fair market value coverage on my home insurance when my house was burned down in a fire, I would not have been able to buy a new home in Boone County. I had replacement value, which was what saved me ultimately to be able to build a new house. So I think we should go to a replacement value theory as well in order to ensure that this isn't going to dislocate you, this isn't going to displace your communities. Things along those lines are just basic substantive reforms and procedural reforms to protect property owners in Kentucky.
Okay. I want to thank our guest, Rep. TJ Roberts. You can reach him on X at Real TJ Roberts. Please give to his campaign, support a young thought leader in the Liberty wing of the Republican Party. You've been listening to Kentucky's Voice. Thank you for joining us today.